El profesor Martin Daly es bachelor en Psicología en la Universidad de Toronto. Su maestría la hizo en Psicología en McGill y finalmente hizo su doctorado en la Universidad de Toronto en Psicología. Actualmente es profesor emérito de la Universidad de McMaster en Hamilton, Ontario, Canadá, y profesor investigador de antropología en la Universidad de Missouri. Junto con Margot Wilson, se constituyeron uno de los investigadores y autores pioneros de mayor impacto en la psicología evolucionista. Por favor. Su principal tema de estudio ha sido el conflicto interpersonal y violencia, y dentro de este tema ha prestado especial atención al conflicto entre hombres y conflicto en su familia con soluciones violentas. El profesor Martin Daly cuenta con varios libros, algunos de ellos son muy conocidos en nuestro país, y el primero de ellos fue Sexo, Evolución y Conducta, y le siguió el de Homicidio, que se conoce aquí por el Fondo de Cultura Económica, y del mismo modo La verdad sobre Cenicienta, una aproximación darwiniana al amor parental. El efecto Cenicienta es el tema del que nos va a hablar hoy el profesor Martin Daly. Para quienes no conocen su trabajo y el efecto Cenicienta, este se ocupa del maltrato infantil naturalmente en relaciones familiares, y probablemente haga un énfasis en los hijos adoptados. Quien comentará esta presentación del profesor Martin Daly es Germán Gutiérrez. El profesor Germán Gutiérrez es psicólogo de la Universidad Nacional, hizo su maestría en psicobiología en la Universidad de Texas, su doctorado en neurociencias del comportamiento en la misma universidad. Actualmente es director y profesor del Departamento de Psicología de la Universidad Nacional. Es presidente de Ascofapsi y, como ustedes muy bien lo saben, es organizador de este evento. El profesor Germán Gutiérrez ha tenido numerosas publicaciones, premios y reconocimientos por su labor tanto académica como gremial. Su principal tema de investigación gira alrededor de la selección sexual, mecanismos básicos de aprendizaje e historia de la psicología, principalmente en los temas de psicología comparada. Actualmente es investigador y líder del grupo de investigación en aprendizaje y comportamiento animal, categoría A en Ciencias. Los dejo entonces en compañía de los dos expositores, empezando por el profesor Martin Daly.
Good morning. I hope I can be heard. It's okay. I'm very honored to be a participant in this wonderful series of talks, the Mercedes Rodrigo lecture series, and the topic I'm going to speak on today has been foreshadowed in that kind introduction. The topic of the mistreatment of stepchildren, the question of the extent to which stepchildren may be the victims of discriminative mistreatment. Concept I'm going to refer to is something we call in English discriminative parental solicitude, the discriminative parental affection. Parents are not always identically responsive to different children, and that's not surprising to an evolutionist. Parental care has costs, time costs, energy costs, opportunity costs in terms of things you could be doing otherwise if you weren't caring for these little parasites. And if parental motives have been shaped by a history of natural selection, then we would expect them to exhibit some sort of design in quotation marks, designed for the function of allocating parental cares in ways that promote parental fitness. By fitness, we mean parental reproductive success and long-term survival of parental genetic materials. And I'm speaking about animals generally here, not just human beings. So what sort of discriminations might one expect parental psychologies to have evolved to make? The biologist Richard Alexander suggested a number of years ago that these fall into three main categories. The first two are discriminations with respect to the quality of the child. How able is this offspring to convert parental investment into gains in parental fitness? So, for example, we might expect birds to stop incubating cracked eggs because it's a waste of time. Second question is, how much need does the offspring have? How much difference will this investment make? Because some offspring are well capable of caring for themselves at a certain stage, and parental investment in that sense is kind of wasted also. But I'm not going to talk about either of those topics today. I'm going to talk about one corollary of the third issue that we might expect discrimination along, and that is the issue of the identity of the child. Is this infant really mine? There's good reason to expect that animals should have evolved to care selectively for their own offspring, or for offspring who present cues that they are their own offspring, even if you sometimes make mistakes. I want to illustrate that with some non-human examples before turning to the issue of discriminative mistreatment of human stepchildren. I'm going to start with a famous allegation of indiscriminate parenting, of parental care that is not discriminatively directed toward one's own offspring, in a particular species of bat, the free-tailed bat Cátedra brasiliensis, which, despite the name that suggests it's a Brazilian bat, is called in North America, in English, the Mexican free-tailed bat, and is in fact an animal that exists from the United States all the way to Argentina. Herman is familiar with this animal because he studied in Austin, Texas, where these same bats are a bit of a tourist attraction as they emerge from underneath a bridge in Austin. And they're a spectacular aggregation of animals. These bats form the largest groups known in any mammalian species. The size of this particular colony in Texas has been estimated at 20 million bats. And this is a photograph of a group of free-tailed bats emerging from a colony in Bracken Cave, Texas, to go forage at dusk. The interesting thing about these bats is they have these breeding colonies inside a cave. They're very densely aggregated in the dark. Very soon after birth, on the day that mothers give birth, they leave to go out foraging, and they just hang their pups up on the roof as they go out, being bats. But the pups are mobile, and they crawl over each other, and there's a density of little baby bats who are like as big as the last digit on your small finger. There's a density of up to 3,000 baby bats per square meter, and they're crawling over each other. And it seems implausible that when mothers return after a night's foraging that they could find their own babies. And people who studied these bats 50 years ago initially concluded that mothers cannot possibly find their own bats. And they suggested that nursing females constitute what they call an anonymous dairy herd, like a herd of cattle who would just feed whatever young was put near them. And indeed, they did a couple of little experiments. They held lactating females in their hands and then allowed a pup to approach her, and indeed a pup would latch onto the nipple of any female who was lactating was offered to the pup. The question that an evolutionary biologist might ask about this conclusion is, how is this possible? How could such anonymous lactation evolve and persist under the influence of natural selection? The idea is that if the bats indeed constitute an anonymous dairy herd feeding whatever pup they encounter, the natural selection should favor those females who invest the most time and energy in producing the biggest, healthiest pup and then just leave it in the care of the other bats. Why nurse when your milk is being distributed to anybody? And you would think selection might favor drying up, not being a lactating female at all. How could indiscriminate lactation persist over evolutionary time if it were indeed true? The thinking here is that we expect selection to favor those attributes that promote the survival and well-being of one's own young and the replication of one's own genes in competition with other members of one's own species. Well, it turns out that this initial conclusion was wrong. It seems impossible that mothers could find their own pups, but in fact they do. And a group of researchers, led by a fellow named Gary McCracken, set out to find out whether these bats were succeeding in finding their own young by genotyping mothers and young who were nursing together, and showed that although there are errors, well over 80% of mother-pup pairs where the pup is nursing are indeed mother and her own offspring, that they do find their own pups. And this became a basis for a bunch of interesting further research about how on earth do they do this. The pups have distinct ultrasonic calls, the mothers have exquisite capability of discriminating these things, and there's some additional complications as well. The interesting thing, the reason I'm telling you this story, is because there are specializations in these animals for solving this very difficult problem of finding your own young in a chaotic mass of pups in a cave, in a dark cave. We wouldn't expect all animals to have such specialized capabilities. So a question to ask is, under what circumstances, in what animals, in what species would we expect to find that mechanisms, psychophysiological mechanisms, would have evolved to solve this kind of problem, to discriminate your own young from alien young? And the obvious answer is that we would expect to find this where there's a natural risk of errors, where parents encounter a bunch of seemingly similar young and have to find their own. And in some animal species that is a common problem, and in others it is not a problem at all. So in this case, only where there's a natural risk of errors would we expect to find these mechanisms of discrimination. And I should illustrate that principle comparatively, by which I mean comparing related animal species. Here we have two closely related fish-eating birds from the North Atlantic. Guillemots on the left, razorbills, on your left, razorbills on your right. These animals are very similar in some ways, but they nest in a different manner that's illustrated here. In the guillemots on the left, pairs nest close together on the same rocky ledges. The pairs are separated by only a few centimeters, and eggs can roll a little distance. Chicks, shortly after hatching, can move. And so there is some possibility of parents encountering strange young at the spot where they expected to encounter their own young. The razorbills, on the other hand, set up their nests on a little rocky ledge separate from any other razorbill, meters apart from any other razorbill. And it never happens that eggs get displaced into somebody else's nest, or that chicks can move from one nest to another. Well, many years ago, an animal behavior student named Tim Burkhead studied these two species by doing experiments in which he would put a strange egg in the nest in place of the bird's own egg, or a strange chick in the nest in place of the bird's own chick. And what he found was in the guillemots, where there is a natural risk of encountering strange young, they immediately reject the foster egg as not my own. They look at it, they see it's not their own egg, and they go looking for their own egg. Likewise with the chick. The razorbills, there's no problem. There's an egg in my nest. There was an egg in my nest when I left to go get some fish. I sit on it. They simply lack the discriminative capability, or if you like, the discriminative inclination. The implication I'm suggesting is that natural selection equips animals with psychologies that are successful in allocating parental investment to the parent's own young. And insofar as there is no problem of recognizing your own young simply by recognizing your nest site, you don't have to do anything further. But if this implication is correct, we have a puzzle of why step-parenting even exists. Why does any animal ever care for young who are not their own and who they have clear evidence are not their own? And in the case of step-parenting, of course, we're talking about caring for the young of your mate who existed when you met that mate, or the young of your predecessor. Well, in many species, step-parenting doesn't exist. Those who acquire a new mate with dependent young simply typically kill them. So in the case of swallows, for example, illustrated here, they usually have biparental care. The mother and father both feed the chicks in the nest. If either parent disappears, then the surviving parent may be courted by a new mate, and if they accept the new mate, then the new mate simply kills the kids, throws them out of the nest, and then they re-nest. And that's quite common. But there are other species in which step-parents either ignore the young and let them be raised to maturity, or even help raise them. And that's illustrated here with a falcon, in which, when the same thing happens, when one parent loses its mate, a new partner appears on the scene and will help them raise the young. And Homo sapiens, the human animal, is obviously one such species in which step-parents sometimes help raise young. So step-parenting is not unique to human beings. The argument has been made, I think persuasively, or I'm a co-author on this paper is one reason I think it's persuasive, but by Sievert Rower and colleagues, the argument has been made that we can understand step-parenting as a component of mating effort or courtship, that the species in which it occurs are species in which the pair will stay together for a relatively long time and may raise successive broods of young. Where you don't see step-parenting is where pairs form for a single season and break up, and there's no chance of reproducing again with the same partner. So arguably, helping to raise step-parents is a component of the courtship effort of establishing a new partnership. Which brings us to the topic of human step-parenthood. Even in a species where step-parents help, we may still expect to see there's some preferential treatment of one's own offspring. A step-parent still might value a stepchild less than they value their own child. So the question arises, are stepchildren really victims of discrimination? And this is an illustration from an old edition of the fairy tale Cinderella. I'm not sure Cenicienta is familiar to everybody here, but there are stories of mistreated stepchildren in essentially all societies in the world, folk stories of mistreated stepchildren. One might imagine that for that reason alone, when child abuse became a subject of research, that people might have asked the question of whether stepchildren were at risk. But surprisingly, at least surprisingly to me, nobody did for the first 20 years or so in the 60s and 70s. First 20 years or so of child abuse research. And so before 1980, nobody had really asked this question. And My late wife Margot, who was illustrated in the picture, Margot Wilson and I and a student, at that time, coming from a background in non-human animal behavior, became interested in this question and conducted what turned out to be the first investigation of it, using data from the United States American Humane Association, which is an organization that aggregates child abuse reports, legally required child abuse reports from various kinds of agencies that deal with children. And I won't go into detail about this early study except to say we have illustrated here, you'll notice, children's age, and then we have victims per 1,000 children of that particular age category. So we have a rate of child maltreatment. And we're looking just at child abuse reports, validated child abuse reports, for children living in two-parent households, either with their two genetic parents, their two birth parents, or with a birth parent and a step-parent. And obviously the risks are substantially higher. The rates of abuse seem to be substantially higher in the step-parent homes. Now, one thing I want to stress immediately and throughout the rest of this talk is that this is not experimental science. This is correlational study of naturally occurring phenomena. And it's always possible, when you see a contrast like this, that it doesn't really reflect a genuine difference between these two household types, but reflects something else, like a bias in detection. Perhaps abuse by step-parents is more often reported than abuse by genetic parents. You can imagine the circumstance, I think, where you're living next door to a child who seems to have bruises on their face repeatedly or other signs that perhaps they're being mistreated at home. And maybe you'd be a little more suspicious, a little quicker to phone the relevant authorities if you knew that the man in the house was the mother's new boyfriend rather than the father, for example. I mean, it's possible. So one has to worry about the possibility that when you find a difference like this, it's an artifact. It's the result of something else than the apparent difference that you're stressing. For that reason, we soon turned our attention from non-lethal abuse, from abuse in which there's likely to be a high incidence of reporting biases, to lethal child abuse, to cases in which children are killed by the parents. On the assumption that such cases are more consistently detected, there would be less likelihood of biases. And so I'll show you some Canadian data next. I'm a Canadian. At the time I was living and working in the USA, and then just before this paper appeared, Margot and I moved back to Canada, and we began doing some studies of Canadian homicide data. And the interesting contrast is that in the most extreme and unequivocal cases, such as lethal child abuse, where a child is, for example, beaten to death, the difference between step-parent and genetic parent homes get bigger, not smaller, than in the data I just showed you. So here are data for homicides. We've now made it per million co-residing couples, or co-residing parent-child dyads, I should say, parent-child pairs. Now made it per million rather than per 1,000 children, because the rates are very much lower, of course. There are cases there under genetic parent that looks like very few. There's actually quite a lot of cases of genetic parents killing newborn children. In Canada, there were about 8 or 10 cases of neonaticides, the murder of newborn babies by mothers per year. And that's all included in the leftmost bar, but it's still a very low rate. The rates for step-parents are, of course, very much higher, but bear in mind that children age 0 to 2 years, children under 2 years of age, very seldom have step-parents. So this doesn't necessarily imply a huge number of cases. There's actually more cases by genetic parents in absolute numbers. There's more cases by killings by genetic parents than by step-parents. But very few very young children live with step-parents, and when they do, it's a risky circumstance. And I think contrasts like this suggest that no, this is not due to bias detection, this is a real phenomenon. That said, it could still be an artifact of something else. It could be that step-parent versus genetic parent is not itself the crucial distinction here, but that that's simply correlated with something else. You have to worry about the possibility that an effect like this is really caused by something other than step relationship, by some genuine risk factor that's simply correlated with step relationship. And an obvious example is poverty. And several people have suggested maybe this is an artifact of poverty, that poor people, they have higher divorce rates, there's more single mothers bringing in new boyfriends, the risk, what looks like a risk from step-parents is actually a risk associated with poverty. This may not be true everywhere, but certainly in both Canada and the United States, this simply turns out not to be the case, because if you look at the two types of families in the population as a whole, families with two genetic parents and families with a step plus genetic parent, and look at the income distributions, they're essentially identical. Poverty is a risk factor for child abuse, but it seems to be an independent risk factor. It can't explain away the phenomenon of excess risk at the hands of step parents. If it's not poverty, a second possibility is that this reflects the difference between registered marriages and what I've called common law or de facto marriages, couples living together who have not legally married. And this argument has been made particularly by a British student of family relations who suggested that no, this isn't really a step-parent risk thing, it's a new mother's boyfriend risk issue. And it turns out that this is not the case either, that yes, de facto versus registered marriage is a risk factor. De facto unions have higher rates of child maltreatment than registered marriages, but it's another independent risk factor, or largely independent, and I'll show you Canadian data to illustrate this. Here we have just cases in which children under 5 years of age were beaten to death by their fathers. And I'll show you other data based on this same subcategory. So we're leaving out things like, for the moment, we're leaving out things like neonaticides by new poor mothers killing the baby at birth. We're leaving out, family massacre from suicide, where a man maybe gasses his whole family or something like that, a depressed man. We're just talking about cases where the child was beaten to death in an assaultive manner. And I've partitioned this out into stepfathers versus genetic fathers. I mentioned here on this slide for the first time, I could have mentioned it all along, in parentheses it says genetic fathers. We say genetic father and mother, but in fact, of course, we don't know. We don't have the genetics to confirm. Fatherhood is always a supposition, but the presumed fathers. And what you see here from the numbers, which are all rates per million such father-child pairs living together, is that both of these factors, stepfather versus genetic father, and de facto or common law union versus registered marriage, they're both risk factors. Stepfathers beat children to death at much higher rates than genetic fathers within both categories of marriages. And de facto unions are more dangerous than registered marriages within both categories of fathers. So again, we've got another risk factor, but it doesn't abolish the excess risk from stepfathers. A third suggestion, and one that has to be taken seriously, is perhaps we're looking at an artifact that's a consequence not of the step relationship itself, but of the traits of people who become step-parents. Perhaps, violent people are more likely to be in remarriages than in first marriages. That's, I'm sorry if I'm insulting the stepfathers in the audience, but it's it's a plausible hypothesis that stepfathers generically are just a more violent group, and more violent towards everybody, and it has nothing to do with the step relationship. The best evidence I have against that has to do with the fact that in some cases of in some data sets where you have a number of children who are abused, what you find is that there are homes in which there are children of a former union, stepchildren, and there are also children of the present union. So there'll be an older child from the woman's previous relationship, and then a child of the present union in the same marriage. And when you have such cases, what you find is that abusive step-parents have usually been selective. They have been targeting the older stepchild. And so here we have, from 3 different studies, one in Pennsylvania, that's a state in the United States, the other 2 from Canadian cities, Hamilton, where I used to live, and another small Canadian city. Cases known to child welfare authorities investigated all such cases, and then you find that there are 10 households. When I say 10 of 10 such cases, I mean there were 10 households in this sample in which there were both children of the present union and children of the former union, stepchildren. And we're talking about cases in which someone was abused. In all of those cases in the Pennsylvania study, it was only the stepchild that was abused. In our research in Hamilton, Ontario, in the second line, in 9 of 10 cases, it was only the stepchild who was abused. In 1 case, it was both. And similarly for the last one. And this is especially interesting because when you have, in many cases when children are abused, all the children in the household will have been abused. When that's not the case, if they're living with both parents, if you have 2 or 3 or 4 children living with both parents, if one is targeted, there's a statistical tendency for that to be the youngest child, not the oldest. And yet in these cases, the stepchild is consistently the oldest child, and yet is selectively targeted. So I think this suggests that no, you can't explain Cinderella effects, by which I mean the excess risk to stepchildren. You can't explain that in terms of the traits, the general traits of men who become stepfathers, or people who become step-parents more generally. Homicides by stepfathers and homicides by genetic fathers, if you get a large sample of all homicide cases, they differ qualitatively. They differ in their attributes. And we have collected all cases known in Canada over a period of time, and all cases known in England and Wales over a period of time, and made these contrasts that I'll show you in the next slide. Oh, sorry, I forgot to add a couple of other confounds that don't work. Yes, stepchildren tend to have been born to their mothers at a younger age than children living with their both genetic parents. And that is a risk factor, but it explains only a very small proportion of the excess risk to stepchildren. Number of children in the home doesn't either. So far, no confound no correlated factor has explained away the excess risk from stepchildren, excess risk from step-parents to stepchildren. The data I wanted to show you about the qualitative difference are in this slide. Again, we're looking at just killings of children less than 5 years of age by their fathers, by which we mean either genetic fathers in the blue bars or stepfathers in the yellow bars. The n's are the absolute numbers of such cases, so that you can see there are actually more children killed by genetic fathers than by stepfathers in this Canadian sample on the left, and in the British sample on the right as well. But the risk is still substantially higher from stepfathers because we're talking about very young children who seldom have stepfathers. What we're showing here is what proportion of these cases were cases in which the child was violently assaulted. And the reason this is shown with 2 slightly different bits of terminology in the Canadian and British case is simply because the National Homicide Archives categorized the methods of killing in slightly different ways. And in English we say the child was shot, the child was stabbed, the child was smothered, or in Canada they say the child was beaten to death as one category. In England and Wales, the equivalent category, I think it's almost exactly equivalent, was hit or kicked to death. And in both cases, what you see is that about 80% of all children who were killed by stepfathers were assaulted in this violent way, whereas fewer than 50% of the kids who were killed by their genetic fathers, still a substantial number, but a much lower proportion, were killed in this assaultive way. And instead, they're more likely to have been killed in ways that don't look like assaults out of anger, don't look like angry outbursts, look like something else, often associated with depression. And indeed, if you look at whether the man who killed the child also committed suicide in the same act, you see this contrast. In the Canadian data, 63 out of the 177 genetic fathers who killed a child in this way, who killed a child under 5 years of age, committed suicide at the scene of the crime, in the same episode, on the spot. Only one stepfather did. The difference is not quite as large, the proportion is not as high, but the difference is still striking in the British data as well. So in effect, a substantial proportion of genetic fathers who kill kids commit suicide in the same act. It's apparently an act of depressive homicide suicide. Stepfathers who kill kids are almost never in that same state of mind, it seems. It seems it's a qualitatively different kind of a problem. And again, disproportionately often, a sudden angry assault. Now, when you think about everything I've told you so far, it may occur to you that step relationships, if step-parents, which usually means stepfathers, are often dangerous to assault I shouldn't say often, are relatively often assaultive towards small children, then you might imagine this would be a source of conflict between the man and the woman as well. When stepfathers mistreat children, the mothers often try to defend the children. And more generally, there's a lot of evidence that stepchildren cause, engender marital conflict over the problem of how the couple's joint resources are going to be allocated. If you ask couples about the sources of difficulty in their marriage, how money is to be spent on the children arises very high in the list with step families. It arises much lower on the list, or not at all, in two genetic parent families. So, there's, I would argue, chronic tension over how much of the new partner's resources are to be invested in this child of a previous union, even in non-violent families. Well, this suggests that the presence of children from prior unions might also be a risk factor not only to the children, but also a risk factor for violence in the marriage itself. And there's been a huge amount of interest in marital violence and its correlates and causes. But researchers without an evolutionary perspective seem never to have thought to ask this question. And so, for one example, there was a fairly thorough review of the topic of assaults against wives, violence against wives, that appeared in the journal Violence and Victims in 1986. In this particular review, they listed 97 different factors that had been proposed or confirmed to be risk markers, correlates of violence against wives. Paternity of children simply wasn't on the list as something that had even been mentioned. So again, we apparently did the first research on this. There's been other research since. And I'll show you data on both wife assault and wife murder in relation to the paternity of the children. And in this case, I'm going to show you data just from the city that Margot and I were working in, the city of Hamilton, Ontario. And the reason is when you have a sample of wife killings, like a national data set or something, it typically doesn't contain data on whether they're children of the marriage, and it certainly doesn't contain data on whether those children were the genetic offspring of both partners or a stepchild. So you have to get a more local data set and find out everything you can about each case. And I'm going to show you data where we're just looking at cases in which there is a woman who was living with a male partner, and she had children under the age of 18, at least one child under the age of 18, co-residing with her, and then whether we're going to differentiate whether her children were children who were genetic children of the man on the scene, stepchildren of the man on the scene, or at least one of each. Here we see, first of all, data from shelter admissions. This is women going to an abused woman's shelter to escape abuse from a partner. And in these cases, and we're just looking at women who have a co-residing partner and co-residing minor children. And in this particular case, what we found was that there was substantially higher rate. Again, the rate is based on the fact that we have a population at large survey for the city of how many women live in each of these kinds of households that we can use as the denominators to compute the rates. What you see is that women with stepchildren, and regardless of whether there's a child of the present partner or not, which is the mixed category, one of each, regardless, they seem to be seeking refuge at the women's shelter at very much higher rates than women living with partners and children of the present union only. For homicides, the data look a little different, but again, there's risk associated with having stepchildren. And the most striking difference, perhaps, is that at least one of each has a much lower rate of homicide than stepchildren only. There are very few homicides here. I mean, in this, I've got 22 years of data combined here. There's only an average of slightly less than 2 wife murders per annum in this city of 500,000 people. So, there's only 30-something or 40 cases in total in these homicide data. And yet these are highly significant differences nonetheless. And this phenomenon has been replicated in subsequent studies in the US. And also, interestingly, the difference between the left and right here, if you think about it, it would seem to imply that the difference between even just step and genetic only is much larger on the homicides than it is on the shelter admissions. Relatively recently, a group of researchers headed up by Jacqueline Campbell, a nurse in the United States, they've been trying to address the very difficult question of how can you identify within the sample of women who are being beaten by their husbands, the ones who are at risk of escalation to death, of escalation to a killing. Because many women in circumstances with abusive husbands are being counseled. Some of them are reluctant to leave for various financial and other reasons. And these people have been seeking data, a hard basis for giving these women predictive information about the risks that they're facing. And so they've done a massive study in the United States now trying to find out about risk factors for escalation of marital violence to lethality. And one of the 2 principal results they found, because the risk of being abused at all and the risk of being killed by your husband have common risk factors. Poverty, age disparity, many things are risks for both. So if you're looking within the sample of abused women and trying to predict who's at risk of being killed, it's a challenging problem. Anyway, having stepchildren is a risk factor for being abused, but it's also a significant risk factor for escalation to lethality, even within the abused women, is the current evidence from the United States. So how widespread are these Cinderella effects? I mean, I've shown you Canadian and US and British data. And I know there are large differences in child homicide rates by step versus genetic parents in these 4 English-speaking countries where I've had some hand in dealing with the data. There are lots of reports of non-lethal abuse in those same countries, and now in a number of other countries, including Colombia, and I'll say a little bit more about our Colombian study in a minute. And there's also interesting data showing that children with stepfathers in particular, or stepmothers, are at higher risk of mortality for any cause, both in historical data archives in Europe and among modern hunter-gatherers, a non-state face-to-face society of hunter-gatherers, the Ache, in Paraguay. In all of these cases, child mortality is substantially higher for children living with one genetic parent and one step-parent than for children living with two genetic parents. And apparently for reasons of disease and neglect, as you might say, injury, accidental injury, as well as for reasons of assault, as if the children are simply monitored or cared for less well in some ways. The Colombian study is an interesting one that I want to spend a minute on, partly because it was done right here in Bogota, and partly because it used a methodology that has rarely been used and that I think is very interesting and one to use in this kind of study, a so-called case control study. This work was conducted by a group headed by Joanne Clevens, who I believe is actually an American researcher. She's now at the Centers for Disease Control in the United States, but she has been based here in Bogota and a couple of collaborators. And what they did was they got a number of cases of child maltreatment that have been reported either to the Office of Forensic Medicine here in Bogota or to family welfare offices. Severe abuse cases where children have been abused by the father figure, the man in the house. And those are the cases. And then they sought for controls to compare them to somebody who would be in other ways similar. And the way they did this was they went one block over from the residential address of the case and basically went door to door to find a couple who were co-residing with the same age child. And so they've got a control case for each case. And the data look like this. In the cases, which means the abused children, almost half of the children were in fact assaulted by a stepfather. And these children, by the way, averaged in age about one. Just over 50% of them were either 0 or 1 year of age. And so these are very young children. The probability that they would have a stepfather is low. And arguably that probability is perhaps reflected by the controls. And the thing about doing this case control study a block away in the same neighborhood is that provides some control for things like whether the risk factors are neighborhood-related factors of poverty and other things. And what they find is that there's a dramatic difference. It was also interesting, the assaults are all by men, but there were 3, I think, cases where the man was the father or the genetic father of the child, and yet the woman in the household was not the child's, and all of those fall in the abuse cases as well. And actually, if you had eliminated the stepfather, I mean, you look at the stepfathers first, they're significantly higher proportion in the cases. If you take those out and just look at the rest of them, there's a significant excess of stepmother households in the remaining cases compared to the controls, which is interesting with respect to sort of what breaks down the commitment, perhaps what breaks down the commitment of the father to his own child. How am I doing for time right now?
15 minutes?
Okay, I'm fine. There have been a number of attempts to show that these Cinderella effects are not universal or are even artifacts. And a lot of people don't like this phenomenon for whatever reason. And one I want to mention is a study by a Swedish zoologist named Hans Temran of Swedish national homicide data. Swedes are sort of famous for not killing each other much, But they do, and they do kill children. And if you get national data over a period of time, you can run up enough cases to do analyses. And in the original study published by Tamron, they came to the conclusion that there was no excess risk to Swedish stepchildren, that there was no overrepresentation of step-parents as offenders, and that Cinderella effects were absent in Sweden. But they did the analysis wrong, in a way that reviewers of this paper should have caught and didn't. Basically, they computed rates of homicide for children 15 years of age and under. And so for the denominator of this rate, if they wanted stepchildren, they would say how many children aged 0 to 15 are co-residing with a step-parent? And they get some proportion like 10%. And then how many of the homicide victims are co-residing with the step-parent? And that's also 10%. The trouble is, the likelihood that you have a step-parent increases monotonically with your age, increases year by year with your age. So that children aged 0, 1, 2 almost never have step-parents. And then there's just sort of a linear increase in the likelihood that you have a step-parent. In Sweden, up to 15 to 20% by the time you're 15. So the average was close to 10% for those children, for all children. But the children who were actually killed were very young children. They averaged 0 to 1 years of age, or the majority of them were 0 to 1 years of age. So if you break it out properly, what you find, and here I've reanalyzed their own data with respect to, I say parent-toddler dyads, pardon that terminology, I mean children under the age of 5 again, children aged 0 to 4. And what you find is that there is a substantial Cinderella effect in the Swedish data. There is excess risk to the stepchildren, and it was just masked by the fact that they lumped all the children of all ages together. It is interestingly much smaller than what we were seeing in Canada, for example. The data I showed you before showed that, for the very youngest children, there's the rate is 70 times higher at the hands of a step-parent than at the hands of a genetic parent. In these data, the differential risk is only 8-fold. It's still a big differential risk. This is a topic that warrants a lot of investigation. The magnitude of these Cinderella effects is very variable. I have not seen evidence anywhere that they are non-existent in any sample, but it's possible that someone will find such a sample. They're certainly highly variable from place to place, and nobody really has yet investigated the sources of that variability. I think one very plausible hypothesis in this case is that the Swedish welfare state is such that stepfathers don't feel the same pseudo-parental obligation towards children that they do in some other societies. They're not pressured to invest in them the same way, and therefore they resent them less and get angry at them less. That's one hypothesis. I have no idea if it's true. But we definitely need some investigation of why it is that stepchildren are 8 times more likely to be killed than children living with 2 genetic parents in Sweden, and that the difference is more like 150-fold in Australia. Why? I want to stress also, I don't want anyone to come away from this talk thinking that my point is that parents kill stepchildren in order to relieve themselves of this responsibility, and that this is like an evolved adaptation. Homicides by human step-parents are rare everywhere. It's a very tiny proportion of step relationships. I've portrayed them as so many cases per million co-residing parent-child dyads. And there is no evidence in any society, even a non-state society with no judicial system, there's no evidence that they actually promote the killer's fitness. Unlike the case in some other animals. We have lots of evidence from lions, from certain monkeys, from some birds, that killing your predecessors young actually seems to be an evolved adaptation. It's often referred to as sexually selected infanticide. The idea that animals have been selected specifically to quickly and efficiently dispose of their predecessors' young in order to get their new mate to work on producing their own children. And human beings don't do that. There's no question human beings don't do that. Even when step-parents do kill, they don't do it very efficiently. They don't do it in a way that promotes their own reproductive success. And the vast majority of mistreatment of stepchildren is not lethal and probably actually raises the investment costs for the abusers. So I don't want anybody to get the impression that I was arguing that human beings, like lions, have this evolved adaptation for killing their predecessors young. I do want to suggest that Cinderella effects can better be understood as non-adaptive or maladaptive, occasional rare byproducts of something that is adaptive, and that is what I call discriminative parental solicitude, the preference for your own young over other young. And if that's so, if that's right, then we shouldn't see discrimination against stepchildren just in violence. We should see it in all sorts of non-violent domains. And evidence has been building up that we do. So, DPS, short for discriminative parental solicitude again. I'm going to suggest that homicide is an extreme, in the sort of pseudo-biological terminology, an extreme reverse assay of parental solicitude, of parental love, if you like. But you can have less extreme responses and positive investments, and what do the data suggest? Well, there's been a lot of research in many societies now suggesting that although step-parents care for young, invest in them, arguably as a mating effort, the evidence is that investment by step-parents is restrained relative to that of genetic parents. For example, there are several studies that show that U.S. stepchildren, United States stepchildren with stepfathers get less financial support for higher education from families with exactly the same means, with exactly the same incomes. They're less likely to get support from their families if dad at home is a stepfather than if he's a genetic father. And people don't articulate it that way. They don't say, oh, I'm not supporting this kid to go to college because he's my stepchild. They say, oh, I believe that young people should make their own way in the world, or something like that. But curiously, they seem to say this about stepchildren a lot more than about their own. An economist at Princeton University named Ann Case has done a lot of these studies, and one particularly interesting one that she's done from panel studies of how people spend their resources is that you find that the amount of money that a family spends on food increases linearly with each child in the home that is children of the present marriage. It increases exactly the same way if they're the mother's children but not the father's. But it increases at a lower slope if they're the father's children and not the mother's. And the argument is that stepmothers, mothers, the woman of the household, by and large controls the expenditures on food. And so it's whether it's her stepchild that affects whether incremental expenditures on food match the number of children. Also, again, Ann Case has shown that in stepmother households, but not stepfather households, children who have stepmothers simply have fewer medical appointments, and they have their teeth checked by the dentist less frequently, again controlling for the socioeconomic status of the family. So fairly subtle forms of minor discrimination that are nevertheless discriminative. And there's lots of other examples, and they're not just coming from the US. I'll mention a few studies from other societies. An anthropologist named Mark Flynn, studying villagers in Trinidad, has shown that men who are co-residing with stepchildren, they simply spend less time than do genetic fathers in otherwise parallel circumstances. Anthropologist Kermit Anderson, studying people in South Africa, has shown that Xhosa men who are nonviolent and investing in the children and being nice dads, nevertheless help their own children with their homework more than they help their stepchildren. And another anthropologist, Frank Marlowe, studying Hadza hunter-gatherers in Tanzania, has shown that men who are babysitting children, sitting with the children while their wives are out foraging, because the men hunt and the women forage, and the women actually work a lot more hours than the men do. When the men are sitting in camp with the kids, they initiate play with their own children, but they never initiate play with their stepchildren. And finally, one of the most striking things, again by Mark Flynn, who, after he worked in Trinidad, began to work in Dominica, he has shown that in Dominican villagers, the stress hormone cortisol is chronically elevated in children who are living in step households, even though there aren't dramatic signs of stress. The circumstances of these villages are economically very similar, but children who are living with two genetic parents just have chronically lower levels of cortisol than children who are living with their mother and a stepfather. All of these kinds of evidence suggest to me that step-parenthood, even when it's nonviolent, still involves some withholding of resources, less parental affection, less assiduous care, less careful care of the children. And I think this accords perfectly well with common experience. And parental love and the extent to which parents are selfless, the extent to which they're willing to give to others with no return, is kind of special. It's, you know, in most relationships, if all the resources flow from me to you, at a certain point I get angry and cut off the resource flow. Parents seem to be willing to make resource flow. Obviously, sometimes they hope the kids will care for them in their old age. But if they don't, it's a one-way flow of resources. And this is cross-culturally general phenomenon. Parental investment involves a very long, accumulating, piling up, one-way flow of resources, and unlike in any other relationship, when I say this is uniquely ungrudged, I mean there's no feeling of I'm being victimized because this little parasite is, you know, constantly taking and never giving. It's like, that's what I'm here for, to be sucked dry by my children. So, traditionally, social scientists have talked about parenthood as a role. And although this is sometimes a useful metaphor, you know, there's things you have to learn in order to act out this role. You behave this way in one context and different ways in others. I think it's an unfortunate metaphor, because it sort of implies all you have to do is learn the part and then you'll do it. And it won't. Just being made a parent and just knowing how parents are supposed to behave is just enough to elicit parental feelings. And I think the suggestion that it is, and many people who don't like the data that I've shown you today have tried to suggest, oh no, step-parents are just as loving as genetic parents. It's a very odd position to take. It seems to me to deny the specialness and the profound nature of parental love. And I am done. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. Muchísimas gracias por su muy interesante presentación. Y yo tengo algunos breves comentarios sobre la presentación en sí misma, y muy breves porque tengo también algunas preguntas que probablemente introduciremos al final con sus propias preguntas, y seguramente algunas de ellas coincidirán con las suyas. Y aparte de los breves comentarios que tengo sobre la presentación, tengo otros comentarios un poco más generales que explicaré en un segundo. Quisiera comentar sobre algo que fue señalado al final de la presentación, o que fue sugerido al final de la presentación, y es que la evidencia es no solamente de parte de los profesores Daly y Wilson, es una evidencia impresionante sino que es una evidencia creciente. Especialmente es creciente en el sentido de que grupos en diversas partes del mundo empiezan a mostrar y a confirmar que dicha evidencia va en la dirección presentada inicialmente por Daly y Wilson. Siendo así, es un poco preocupante que, o debería haber una preocupación por este efecto, una preocupación social, y para mí es un poco preocupante que no la haya, que efectivamente a nivel social haya poco conocimiento de este tipo de datos, de este tipo de evidencia y de las implicaciones que tiene esta evidencia. Voy a regresar a ello en unos minutos, pero por ejemplo, para no ir muy lejos, la evidencia final, casi que la última diapositiva presentada sobre en un país del Caribe, de que niños con padres adoptivos o padres, mejor, padrastros, tengan niveles crónicos de cortisol altos, por ejemplo, debería sugerirnos de nuevo esa preocupación en el sentido de que sabemos que esos niveles de cortisol altos están asociados con una serie de efectos diferentes que incluyen efectos sobre la salud, pero especialmente cuando esos niveles son altos en edades tempranas para los niños, y los efectos sobre el aprendizaje y sobre otros factores conductuales son obviamente en casos extremos devastadores, en otros casos por lo menos tienen un efecto negativo. Y quizás la pregunta es por qué estos factores, por qué este efecto no solamente no es utilizada esta información, no es conocido, sino también por qué no parece producir esa preocupación. Yo quisiera no plantear unas hipótesis en términos exhaustivos, pero por lo menos sugerir algunas ideas. Por una parte es posible que esto sea, y parece que lo es, una verdad incómoda. Socialmente no sé, es incómodo pensar que tratamos diferencialmente a nuestros hijos en general. Creo que una de las preguntas más difíciles que los padres tenemos que contestar constantemente es si queremos igualmente a nuestros hijos, y la respuesta estándar para todos nosotros es que sí, que no hay diferencias en esos afectos. Para el caso de padrastros es posible seguramente que también esa pregunta sea igualmente incómoda y por tanto esto se transfiera socialmente como una verdad incómoda. Sin embargo, del otro lado, me parece que también hay otros factores que pueden contribuir a que no estemos haciendo estas consideraciones. Por ejemplo, los datos presentados son datos en los cuales el efecto es un efecto dramático, es un efecto significativo, pero también al mismo tiempo, del otro lado, sugeriría que hay un número importante de familias en las cuales hay padrastros y madrastras, en las cuales por lo menos no hay un índice reportado de abuso físico o sexual o abuso psicológico. También voy a regresar a eso en unos minutos, pero quizás el riesgo acá, o la razón por la cual no sería considerada la información, es porque o pensamos socialmente que puede haber un riesgo de generalización y que esto tenga un efecto de estigma sobre las familias o sobre los padres, sobre los padrastros y madrastras, que son, si atendemos a una presentación pasada en esta misma cátedra, un grupo creciente de familias, no solamente en nuestra sociedad, sino en muchísimas sociedades modernas. En esa misma línea de que hay un número de familias en las cuales justamente este tipo de abusos no se presenta, a pesar, como decía, de ese efecto dramático, quisiera sugerir que una línea de trabajo que me parece que podría ser interesante sería una línea de trabajo, si se quiere, revertida, si se quiere, positiva, en el sentido de ya no solamente ver qué es lo que hace que exista la posibilidad de que exista abuso en una familia con padrastros o madrastras, o con padrastro o madrastra, sino mirar a las familias en las cuales esto no ocurre, mirar a las familias en las cuales esta condición, si se quiere, ha sido superada en alguna medida y estas familias han tenido otro tipo de interacción entre padres e hijos o entre padrastros e hijos, y a partir de allí pensar en posibles variables que puedan interactuar de una manera positiva o catalizar, si se quiere, este efecto observado. Para mí algo más general, como decía ahora, regresaré más adelante con algunas preguntas sobre la presentación misma, pero quisiera hacer algunos comentarios un poco más generales en relación con las explicaciones de tipo evolutivo de fenómenos psicológicos y de fenómenos sociales. No, creo que no nos queda la menor duda de que la teoría de evolución desarrollada por Charles Darwin y por una gran cantidad de colegas desde entonces, desde hace 150 años hasta nuestros días, han tenido un impacto tremendo en el pensamiento universal. Han cambiado la forma en que vemos nuestro mundo y especialmente han cambiado la forma en que nos vemos a nosotros mismos. Sin embargo, su comprensión se limita a un grupo relativamente pequeño de personas educadas alrededor del mundo y su aceptación a un grupo aún menor. Y las ideas presentadas por Darwin en el origen de las especies en su obra general son poderosas, y lo son tanto que es imposible ignorarlas. Se trata, en muchos casos, como lo hemos visto en la presentación de hoy, de ideas controversiales, en tanto cuestionan ideas arraigadas acerca del origen y el sentido de la vida, la forma en que se organiza nuestro mundo, la naturaleza humana y aún la existencia del Dios bíblico y su relación con el hombre. Y aquí parece estar el origen, en esa controversia, de la resistencia a aceptar las implicaciones del trabajo de Darwin y de los científicos que desde hace 150 años han venido alimentando la evidencia que soporta sus argumentos centrales. Quisiera sugerir que ese limitado impacto de las ideas evolutivas en las ciencias del comportamiento o en las ciencias sociales en general puede deberse a por lo menos tres tipos de razones: razones ideológicas, razones conceptuales y razones metodológicas. Primero, el encargo percibido de la sociedad a las ciencias sociales tiende a favorecer explicaciones más inmediatas y ontogenéticas de los problemas humanos, consecuentemente de sus soluciones. En este contexto, las teorías evolutivas son percibidas como deterministas, lo que obviamente encuentra resistencias importantes en ambientes no solamente académicos, sino también en ambientes políticos ligados a las ciencias sociales. Una limitación vinculada a esta idea es lo que algunos autores han llamado la falacia naturalista, según la cual, si aceptamos una explicación evolutiva de un fenómeno de comportamiento, estamos sugiriendo que dicho fenómeno es inevitable y que debe ser aceptado, y que además es imposible modificar dicho comportamiento. Esto no es cierto, y en ninguno de los casos, incluido hoy la sugerencia de nuestros colegas que han presentado trabajos de este tipo, van en esa dirección. Quisiera darles un ejemplo muy sencillo, un ejemplo personal. Hace algunos años vino a mi oficina en la universidad vinieron un par de estudiantes de una universidad en Bogotá, de una facultad de periodismo, que estaban haciendo como parte de su trabajo final un periódico y habían escuchado que yo trabajaba en evolución del comportamiento, y en particular querían preguntarme si era cierto que había una explicación evolutiva que sugiriera que los hombres eran o podían ser infieles con más frecuencia que las mujeres. Quizás con un poco o con mucha inocencia, como suele ocurrirnos a los académicos, debemos explicarles teoría de selección sexual y otra serie de cosas a partir de las cuales podía explicar esa misma idea que ellas estaban sugiriendo, y pues por lo menos en principio yo quedé satisfecho con lo que habíamos conversado. A las semanas me trajeron el periódico que habían editado, y el titular del periódico era más o menos: profesor de la Universidad Nacional afirma que los hombres son infieles por naturaleza y no hay nada que hacer al respecto. Obviamente mi primera preocupación fue que mi esposa viera el titular, y creo que hasta el día de hoy no lo había visto, y hoy estoy en una especie de confesión acá en ese sentido. Pero claramente hay una explicación en ese sentido de la falacia naturalista, de sugerir que por el hecho de que hay una comprensión que efectivamente es más frecuente la infidelidad en hombres que en mujeres, y que hay una serie de factores que además no es exclusiva de hombres, debo decirlo, pero que por esa razón esta debiera ser una idea aceptada o un efecto aceptado. Creo que para ninguno de nosotros no sería difícil aceptar que los matrimonios y las relaciones en general son en muchos sentidos contratos sociales, y alguna gente argumenta que lo son también contratos evolutivos a lo largo de nuestra historia evolutiva, pero que son contratos sociales, y dentro de esos contratos sociales nosotros podemos incluir algunas condiciones particulares, y con frecuencia las condiciones de fidelidad hacen parte de esos contratos sociales. El cumplimiento o incumplimiento de ese contrato es un asunto que está muy ligado a la interacción de la pareja, y los efectos que pueda traer ese incumplimiento, sobre todo el incumplimiento descubierto, están íntimamente ligados a cómo fue hecho dicho contrato, pero también están ligados a ese contrato evolutivo más general. Otro ejemplo que quisiera señalar de otro orden en esta misma dirección es la idea de que un hallazgo fundamental de los psicólogos sociales a lo largo de los últimos 50 años ha sido el hallazgo de que para todos los humanos, y para algunos animales inclusive también se ha descubierto otro tipo de cosas, tenemos una tendencia a categorizar el mundo, a hacer categorías del mundo que nosotros percibimos y el mundo con el cual nosotros interactuamos. Gracias a esa categorización nosotros podemos inclusive navegar físicamente por el mundo. Si yo no pudiera discriminar entre un mueble y su existencia o no existencia en un espacio particular, o si no pudiera discriminar entre la carretera y el andén, podría cometer errores fatales en relación con en qué lugar conduzco el automóvil o por qué lugar yo camino. Pero también algunas de esa discriminación, o mejor de esa categorización, es una categorización social. Categorizamos a hombres y mujeres, categorizamos a las personas con base en su edad y en otra multitud de características. Pero el reconocimiento aquí, o lo que han descubierto los psicólogos sociales, es que esa categorización con frecuencia conduce a otro efecto que es igualmente natural, que es un efecto de discriminación. Discriminación en este sentido, no con una valoración, sino discriminación en el sentido de señalar que hay algo que es diferente de otro algo. Sin embargo, también han descubierto los psicólogos sociales que esa discriminación con frecuencia empieza a alcanzar unos niveles en los cuales ya ahora sí, en la forma en que utilizamos el término discriminación a nivel social más popular, que esa discriminación puede conducir a efectos negativos de tipo social cuando hacemos atribuciones acerca de la existencia de unas características en grupos de personas a quienes quizás no deberíamos atribuir tal tipo de características. Todos conocemos ejemplos claros y nos admiramos en algunos casos cuando esa discriminación ocurre en otros lugares y es un poco diferente en nuestro ambiente, pero quisiera sugerir que, si bien es cierto, para nosotros no es tan absolutamente claro y evidente los efectos de discriminación social, por ejemplo, en nuestra sociedad, sobre la base del color de la piel, existe, como han mostrado una multitud de investigadores. Sí es muy evidente para nosotros la discriminación sobre la base de nuestro estatus social, y quizás por ello llevamos a cabo una serie de acciones que busquen disminuir esa discriminación o inclusive aumentarla en otros casos cuando se trata de buscar un efecto de este orden en nuestro favor. Una segunda forma, una segunda razón por la cual las explicaciones evolutivas no parecen haber tenido el efecto deseado o esperado sobre las ciencias del comportamiento es que históricamente las ciencias del comportamiento han planteado una distinción entre filogenia y ontogenia, entre naturaleza y cultura, en relación con los orígenes del comportamiento y especialmente del comportamiento humano. Con frecuencia, inclusive las teorías en psicología se alinean alrededor de los ejes de esa distinción, con consecuencias por supuesto muy negativas para la comprensión integral de este antiguo problema. Y en nuestros días las teorías epigenéticas han empezado a trabajar en favor de una eliminación, una disminución de esa distinción entre naturaleza y cultura y sus efectos sobre la conducta, pero esa distinción continúa estando en el centro de las discusiones, no solamente de la psicología, sino de las ciencias sociales en general. Y finalmente, derivado de lo anterior, las diversas disciplinas tienden a concentrar los problemas que se plantean en niveles de explicación particulares. Para la psicología, esos niveles de explicación alrededor de los cuales se concentran la mayor parte de las explicaciones que desarrollamos y de los problemas que nos planteamos son alrededor de las causas proximales y de las causas ontogenéticas, dejando de lado las causas últimas que son mucho más características de las explicaciones evolutivas. Y lo que quisiera decir para finalizar es hacer una invitación que va en la dirección de lo que esta cátedra ha buscado a lo largo de todo este semestre, ahora que nos aproximamos a nuestra sesión final el próximo sábado, a considerar niveles diversos de explicación y a considerar en qué medida esos niveles diversos de explicación es posible, en algunos casos, integrarlos para dar cuenta de una manera más efectiva, más integral justamente, de los fenómenos del comportamiento que son de nuestro interés. Muchísimas gracias.
En realidad tenemos un gran número de preguntas, varias bastante diversas en la forma de plantear uno de los tantos asuntos que el profesor Martin Daly y el profesor Germán Gutiérrez han formulado. Sin embargo, sí podemos empezar con una bastante general que hace referencia a las diferencias que podrían haber entre hombres y mujeres en términos de estas relaciones que se plantean de inversión parental diferenciada, de agresión hacia los niños o niñas adoptadas.
Before I say the response to that, I should apologize for my inability to communicate in Spanish. I want to apologize to the audience for my inability to communicate in Spanish. I am from the Western Hemisphere, and it's kind of inexcusable. When I was growing up in Canada, Spanish was not the second nor the third language they taught, and I apologize. In response to the interesting question about whether stepfathers and stepmothers pose similar risks to children, the data are not good, partly because the phenomena I showed you were overwhelmingly about stepfathers because very young children seldom live with stepmothers, and the numbers of cases are extremely rare. So in a homicide archive for a whole country, you may have dozens of cases of killings of small children by stepfathers and a couple of cases by stepmothers. And still, that's way more than you'd expect by chance, but it's a couple of cases. Surveys asking, for example, about whether adults were abused as children, and also surveys of homeless children who have fled the home and who explain why they fled the home, often in terms of parental abuse, seem to indicate that the risks from stepmothers and stepfathers are actually quantitatively pretty similar, and both greatly in excess of the risks from living in a two-genetic parent family. Does that answer?
La siguiente pregunta está relacionado con el tema de amor parental, entendiendo esto como una emoción, el amor dentro de la lógica evolucionista. Podríamos hablar de otros tipos de emociones que nos podrían contribuir a la tarea de criar hijos. Sería emociones como la simpatía, la compasión y generalmente todo aquello que nos lleva a un comportamiento altruista y prosocial. La pregunta es, ¿qué pasa?
Thank you. I confess I use words like love and parental solicitude rather loosely to encompass some sort of broad notion of an individualized concern for the well-being of the other person. And the questions of how to characterize the emotions involved in both parental care and affection, and also in lapses or failures of parental care, is an interesting one. I think there is certainly something to the idea that parental empathy or attention to a child is something that I would say is an indicator of how strong their individualized affection or concern for the child is. It might not feel like the emotion of love, but parents, for example, pay attention to what their children say more than step-parents do. So if you do studies where you ask, what do you think your child's views are of various issues, and you also ask the children, the concordance is better for genetic parents than it is for step-parents. And that sort of thing may or may not be properly referred to as indicative of greater love. It's indicative of greater attention. I'm not sure how else to respond, because I confess I'm no expert in the sort of partitioning of emotional life into useful categories.
En otra pregunta se formula lo siguiente, y es, al fin y al cabo, el conflicto que surge en familia, el conflicto que puede existir sobre intereses distintos de cada uno de los actores de una familia. La pregunta es, bueno, ¿cuál es el rol que ejerce la pareja, o sea, el padre genético, o también en caso de que sea padre adoptivo, el hijo mismo o la hija misma víctima de ese tipo de maltrato, de abuso? ¿Cuál es el rol de estos actores? ¿Son de carácter permisivo? ¿Hay algún tipo de estudio que nos caracterice el papel que juegan los otros actores en esas situaciones?
Yeah, if I understand the issue correctly, you're referring to the question of in a case, for example, where a stepfather is mistreating a child, have they been given implicit permission to do this by the mother? And of course, there's a variety of answers, I think, but this is more based on case descriptions than on anything that can be quantified. You certainly have cases where a young mother, for example, has a job, she goes out in the day, she leaves the young child with her unemployed boyfriend, and the unemployed boyfriend loses his temper because the baby won't stop crying or something, and kills him in an outburst, and the mother is shocked and outraged and professes no expectation or awareness of such a thing. But there are also cases where it seems clear that the mother has, in some sense, thrown the child to the wolves, that she has committed her career to her new partner, and perhaps both parties are implicated in the abuse of the child, or you certainly read cases in which the mother had knowledge of this and seems to have, in effect, made a decision that she's going to go with the man rather than with the child. Now, ideally, I mean, many men would not want to raise their predecessors' children, and I'm sure many women screen men for this in courtship, but also seek opportunities to place their children with female relatives and things like that as kind of exit strategies. So my guess would be that in many of these cases, and especially the ones that are lethal, where the couples are often young and often not of terribly long duration, that the woman is genuinely surprised. You have anecdotal evidence of both female complicity, female participation, sort of what seems like motivated blindness, if I can use an expression like that, and also, genuine surprise.
Gracias. La siguiente pregunta tiene que ver si existen algunos estudios donde se haya podido establecer si hay o no diferencias cuando los hijos o el hijo que va a ser adoptado tiene algún grado de consanguinidad con alguno de los padres adoptantes versus aquellos casos donde el hijo que va a ser adoptado no tiene ningún tipo de consanguinidad con alguno de los padres.
The issue of families in which there is some relationship with a parent, this is not simply an unrelated new partner, is that what we're talking about? We're talking about cases in which, adoption where the child is completely unrelated to both parties. What we sometimes call in English adoption by stranger, as opposed to adoption by kin. Yeah, there are not terribly good data, but because often we have poor denominators. In the past, we've had surprisingly little good evidence, at least in Canada and the US and Great Britain, about how many adoptive children there really are out there, partly because different agencies claim credit for the same adoption placement. That said, it seems clear that adoptive children are nothing like the risk of stepchildren, and perhaps not at excess risk compared to children living with two genetic parents. But adoptive families, at least in Canada and the States, and I think probably most places, again, talking about these adoption by strangers, they're a very different kettle of fish. They're pardon me, colloquialism, sorry. They're different in many ways. They tend to be affluent. They tend to be infertile and have sought the adoption in many, many cases. And I think the most important thing is they tend to have been screened for suitability. That is to say, when you apply for adoption, unlike when you simply decide to have a child, you're investigated for your motives and your history. And although in contemporary adoption, children do not seem to incur excess risk, and that's wonderful, I wouldn't assume that that's going to be true everywhere. I think we have lots of historical evidence of exploitative adoption, of people adopting children, as more or less slave labor, even as sexual playthings. There's been a lot of very bad mistreatment of adoptees in places where there is no oversight of who wants to adopt. And so I think the oversight of who wants to adopt is the main thing that has abolished excess risk to adoptive children.
Es evidente que el maltrato, el asesinato es una forma de resolución de los conflictos que se pueden dar dentro de una familia. En esa lógica, seguramente podremos encontrar en familias adoptantes otras estrategias que no implican matar a los hijos. Se saben de estudios que ya hayan identificado algunas formas de solución del conflicto, por decirlo de una manera no violenta, siendo familias igualmente adoptantes.
This is an interesting issue. Obviously, violence, I mean, I wouldn't even call it a solution. It creates more problems than it solves. But how people, I think conflict is all universal in step families. There is a tendency for the genetic parent of the child to want more of the couple's joint resources invested in the child than the step parent thinks is an appropriate amount. And my own take on this has always been that articulating that fact, that this is a natural, widespread conflict to be expected, and that the appropriate response to it is to encourage the genetic parent to be appreciative of and to express appreciation of step-parental investment. You know, it's wonderful that you, my new partner, are so committed to me that you're willing to invest in and behave as a good parent to my child, and I appreciate that. I don't take it for granted, because certainly a lot of conflict takes the form of, for example, say the natural mother referring to the child as your daughter, and then the man saying, she's not my damn daughter, or the kid saying, he's not my damn father, and the conflicts become more overt. I would think acknowledging the bases of conflicts would be helpful. I'm not aware of good studies of this, although there's an enormous amount of sort of family clinical literature on step-parenthood, and certainly the conventional wisdom among family therapists, which I assume is based on a lot of experience, is that the first thing they have to do is persuade all parties to abandon what they call the myth of the natural family being reconstructed by a remarriage. That they have to tell people that no, step relationship will not be like genetic relationship. You will never feel the same way towards this child as you might towards your own child, but you can develop affectionate relationships and reciprocal relationships and come to love one another if there's an acknowledgement of the fact that nevertheless this is a different kind of family. That seems to be the conventional wisdom. Whether, I mean, maybe other people know, I'm not aware of anything that deserves to be called rigorous studies, and of course it's hard because you can't exactly randomly assign people to the condition of, you know, divulge this versus behave that way and see what the outcomes are.
¿Alguien? Aquí hay una pregunta verbal que va a hacer el hermano.
Una pregunta para el profesor Rodrigo es si hay algún lugar donde estas ideas hayan dado lugar a cambio en política pública o en programas de prevención del abuso.
I am not aware of any cases in which, you know, findings like the ones I presented today have had any impact on policy. And I'm frankly not sure what impact on policy there might be. I mean, it's a funny thing. I have been, yeah, prevention programs perhaps, exactly. And yet, you know, exactly what the implication should be about those prevention programs, I can say I think it is useful for people to recognize and acknowledge the conflicts endemic in step families, but I can't present strong data in support of that usefulness. And I was going to say, it's a funny thing, I have been asked in cases in which men have killed their stepchildren, I have been asked to be an expert witness by both the prosecution and by the defense. And the prosecution seems to think that somehow telling the story of the risks of violence to stepchildren will make a jury more horrified and will help the prosecution. And the defense seems to think that somehow this is an excuse, a little bit exculpatory, an extenuating circumstance, and this will help. And my reaction in both cases has always been to say, there are facts which I'm happy to put before the people debating policy. I don't think they have any implications one way or the other for, you know, how we should treat those people who have abused stepchildren, and the implications that I'm inclined to draw for how we should counsel people are really my impressions as a human being with a certain amount of knowledge of these cases, rather than anything that I can give strong professional justification for.
Muchas gracias al doctor Martin Daly por su exposición sobre un tema tan polémico como es el